Thanks for being a bit patient. We wanted to make sure we had as many people who were interested in coming along being able to participate in the event. My name is Rich Pancost. I'm the director of the University of Bristol Cabot Institute, and well, we explore all sorts of topics on how we live on, depend on, and shape our planet. This event, however, is being sponsored by Triodos Bank, and I'd like to just say a few words on their behalf to start off. They're Europe's leading sustainable bank, and they are sponsors of this afternoon's event. The bank's commitment to sustainable cities is represented through the hundreds of organizations they lend to, delivering positive environmental, social, and cultural change. Many are in urban areas and include community energy projects, housing associations and care homes, faith groups, art, and cultural centers. Triodos are also headline sponsor of the upcoming Festival of Economics in November here in Bristol, which is a good chance to make a shout out for the Festival of Economics, which is, of course, is a long-standing Festival of Ideas tradition. Oh, see, and I went off script there, and now I've lost my notes here. And the goal of the Festival of Economics will be to provide the opportunity to debate how our economic system can deliver inclusive growth and work better for both people and the planet. And I suspect we might touch on some of those themes this afternoon. I'm not going to talk much. We have quite an esteemed panel, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves and start off with some 5 or 6 minute provocations just to get us all warmed up. But I thought I would just go through and just introduce them by name. This is Mya-Rose Craig, more colloquially known as birdgirl. George Monbiot, Caroline Lucas, and Papa Omotayo. And a special thanks to you for certainly coming the greatest distance. We appreciate you coming to Bristol and appreciate all of you coming back to Bristol. Thank you very much. I'll just start going from right to left, so if you mind kicking things off.
Okay, so wait, I'm not very good with microphones. I'm a bit of a grandma in a girl's body. But, okay, so I'm Maya. I'm 15 years old, and basically I've been in love with nature all of my life. I love going outdoors, and something I'm very passionate about is engaging the Black and Asian minority ethnic, or BAME people, with nature, because if you go to any RSPB reserve, or even if you look around the room right now, to be honest, you can see that there's a distinct lack of ethnic minority people engaged with nature, and I just think that's something that needs to change. According to Wikipedia, a sustainable city is a city designed with consideration of environmental impact, inhabited by people dedicated towards minimization of required inputs of energy, water and food, and waste output of heat, air pollution, CO2, methane and water pollution, which is a bit ungainly and not nice to listen to. But it has an element that a lot of definitions miss out, which is the people. 83% of England's population lives in cities, and it's estimated that about half of the world's population lives in cities and urban areas. So kind of creating sustainable cities is basically key to the future of this planet. And basically, for this to happen, we need everyone, all communities, to be on board and be engaged. In Bristol, 1 in 6 people are BAME. And in London, the figure's closer to 1 in 3. We cannot expect future cities to be sustainable without the inclusion of our communities. And I believe that we need to have future cities where all parts of society, regardless of socioeconomic status or cultural background, understand and buy into the idea that sustainability is the top priority for them. Because inequality of engagement creates inequality of opportunity, and an unequal city is not going to be a sustainable city. There are some pretty shocking numbers, like the fact that 77% of children from high socioeconomic backgrounds go into natural environments every week, but the figure drops down to 56% when you're looking at BAME people as a whole. And what a lot of people seem to forget is that no one's going to care about saving the planet if they don't care about the planet. And Richard Bentwell summed it up perfectly, basically, at the Race Equality in Nature conference I held last year, saying that nature is not a privilege, it's a right. And at the moment I'm talking with lots of environmental leaders from lots of different organisations to encourage them to do something about the issue, and they're all very keen. But even though it's basically something that's been going around for decades within these circles, it's still a very monoethnic sector. And I think rather than more discussions and conferences that seem to be kind of going on all the time, except this one, this was brilliant, but except this one, we need more action that actually makes a difference. And basically, environmental organisations need to reach out with the communities in their own spaces and places. They need to understand what nature means to them instead of imposing their view of nature, which is kind of going down to the local RSPB reserve with a pair of binoculars and admiring all the waders or whatever. But and organisations need to reflect the communities that they're serving, and diversity for them can't be some precursor to action towards sustainability. It's not an afterthought, it's not a side issue, it's one of the most important things, because equality of inclusion is shaping and delivering sustainability is key to success. Thank you.
I hold the radical position that a truly sustainable city requires a new ownership model. At the moment, we can propose all sorts of wonderful things and all sorts of better planning and better inclusion and the rest of it, but basically our cities are owned by a tiny handful of exceedingly rich people. Exceedingly rich and exceedingly powerful people who suck the money out of the city and send it to Panama, broadly speaking. And and these people are massively empowered both economically and politically by their ownership of land. They own the physical fabric of the city. The bricks and mortar on which the land sits are the lesser cost. The real speculative value is in the land underlying those buildings. And because they are their revenues from that land are so lightly taxed, they can extract vast amounts of money from the rest of us, which is why we pay so much in rent, and basically just take it and run with it. This is a constant drain on our wealth, it's a constant drain on our well-being, but it's also a constant drain on our political power and our chances to shape the cities as we would like them to be, because that economic power translates into the power to propose and the power to prevent opposition to their proposals. So they will come up with a wonderful scheme for the regeneration of part of the city, which just happens to involve regenerating everybody out of that part of the city and bringing in a whole lot of richer people instead. But it's going to be so much better. It's going to look so much nicer. Won't you be pleased to have lived in that part of the city where it's going to look so much nicer? And councils are now almost powerless to resist because their budgets have been cut. They're faced with this legal onslaught, which is really, really hard to hold out against. So I've got a radical proposal for how we might deal with this. And it starts with, first of all, a sympathetic government, which we might have in the near future, we never know, a green one, of course, and a government which is prepared to introduce a land value tax. This is an idea which has been around for a long time, it's had support from all the most unlikely places, but it never happens. It's about time it did. And it would be a land value tax primarily aimed at the most lucrative property, the most lucrative land. Tax is really not quite the right word because it's a reclamation of the money with which we have enriched the landowners by paying for all the infrastructure which has made their land valuable. We pay for the roads, for the sewers, for the schools, for the hospitals, and because it's all about location, that has made those patches of land valuable as opposed to some farmland miles away. And so we reclaim that money. Part of that money goes to the state, part to local government to pay for services. The rest is distributed nationally around communities who can use it pretty well as they want. You put it into a commons trust. But one of the things you encourage is for those communities to buy land. Now, land value taxation has brought the cost of land right down, makes it more accessible to buy, accompanied with a community right to buy of the kind that you have in Scotland, and with a community right to land assembly of the kind which you currently have nowhere on earth, but basically allows you to sort of introduce small compulsory purchase orders in order to make a coherent piece of land. Where land has been used completely inappropriately as far as both community and the living planet are concerned, when it comes up for sale, the community has a chance to buy it and then to become the property developer and become the instigator of new ideas and new means of using that land which meet our needs while working within the constraints of the living planet. And so, for instance, you might want to plan an estate, and you get the people on the top of the social housing list and people who put down deposits to buy homes or to rent homes from the Commons Land Trust to come and design that estate themselves. And I think we can take a guess that instead of children being designed out, as they are from almost all estates these days, they're designed in. That instead of cars being designed in, they might be designed out. You're likely, as you know, we see all around the world, that the greater the community involvement in planning, the greener that planning tends to be. Whereas it's the big property developers who turn up and say, we're going to do this regardless of what you think. It's generally very damaging to local people, but also very damaging to the living world on which we all depend. So to make a substantial change to the way that cities are run, to make them more sustainable socially, economically, and ecologically, I believe we need a radical change in the way they are owned.
The MP for Brighton Pavilion and co-leader of the Green Party, and very delighted to be in Bristol, the second greenest city. I'm just saying that to be provocative, you know, Brighton and Bristol vie about this the whole time, but I'm very delighted to be here. And I'm really excited by this panel, to be honest, because it's really interesting. I was thinking that if we'd had this same debate, sustainable cities, even 5 years ago, I think we would have only been talking about the kind of the outcomes in terms of, for example, far less waste going into the environment, into our oceans, our seas and so forth. We'd be talking about how to get people out of their cars and into public transport. We'd be talking about energy systems and so forth. And although all of that is massively important, I think it is really critical and interesting that right now what we're talking about essentially is people and power. And I think Maya gave a fantastic exposition about people being all people, not just a certain subsection, but people are central to this. And as George so powerfully said, this is about who's got power, where are they using it, how are they using it, and how do we make it transparent, to be honest, because quite a lot of this power is underneath the skin of the city. You don't necessarily see it happening. And so I guess what I would just simply add is that when we're talking about sustainable cities, we're also looking at some issues around not just the environmental sustainability, but about inclusion in the ways that Maya talked about, and about power distribution. And so when I was just reflecting about power distribution, I guess I was going to just give 3 examples. One would be the obvious power in terms of energy. And so if you're looking at power distribution in energy terms, then I think we're seeing a renewables revolution already, not least because the economics of renewables are now telling their own story, really, and why on earth we are still going down the road of Hinkley Nuclear Power Station we could have a debate about, but I don't think it's got anything to do with energy, quite honestly. I think it's got a lot to do with nuclear weapons, perhaps, but not very much to do with energy, because it is a massively expensive energy system, as we all know. So the renewables, I think, are here to stay, but I think the exciting thing is about how renewables give power to communities, literally give power to communities in terms of their own energy, but in terms of their control over it. So that potential to make every single home its own powerhouse, in a sense. You know, I don't know why we are building homes that are not passive houses, given we've got the technology to do that. Why do we even give planning permission to homes that are not that way designed, not least because increasingly over a very short space of time they would pay for themselves in terms of the much less money being spent on the running costs of those homes. So yes, we need energy in terms of people having far more control over community energy, schools with solar panels on them, for example, giving away any electricity extra that they generate to the local community, churches having wind turbines to help end fuel poverty, communities collectively borrowing to invest in what is increasingly known as disruptive technologies. So on the one hand, power is about literally the power that is the energy running through our power cables, and also about the grid, crucially, because we often talk about the energy sources without thinking about the fact that in other countries, renewables have priority access to the grid. In other countries, the local area owns the grid. And I think we need to be looking at those more radical ideas when it comes to energy distribution as well. Then when it comes to economic power, and of course Bristol is a great example of this with the Bristol pound in the way that that is representing local people starting to design an economy that meets their own, your own needs, taking money out of the hands of the big institutions that usually control it and putting power and responsibility into the hands of people that are directly affected by what happens in the Bristol economy. And the next steps, I think, would include other aspects of the economy in terms of, building up more credit unions, more community banks. And something we've been experimenting with in Brighton is about the recognition that, I don't know the extent to which this is true in Bristol, but Brighton is definitely a tale of two cities. When you think of Brighton, you think of the trendy, the arts area, the independent, quirky shops. But there is massive poverty in a place like Brighton. There are people in Brighton on the edge of the city who have never been to the seafront because it costs £3.50 returned to get backwards and forwards on a bus. So thinking about sustainability as social inclusion, there's a project that I'm involved in that's looking at how do we make use of those sort of surplus things in society that are not being used but could be used to build greater social capital and to be more of a glue to hold the community together. In other words, seats in theatre rooms like this that aren't otherwise going to be used on a particular night, or at a football club, those seats that aren't being filled. How could we use those as a way of bringing people into our city and then having that much wider debate about sustainability that Maya was talking about? But I think the first step towards that is reaching out to people where they are, and it may well be that a football match is the place that's going to engage them first of all. And what a crazy thing it is that in a particular beautiful football stadium we have in Brighton now, there are empty seats. Well, why aren't we using that? Finding some way of being able to build our communities stronger around things like that. And then my third point actually was very similar to George's about ownership, because mapping who owns what, I think, is a very good way of beginning to see where power lies in a city. And in Brighton, for example, campaigners have been researching the ownership of the different major buildings in the city and doing graphs just to see how entwined all of that is with these big international money flows. In Manchester, artists have been making a 3D tracking the connections between people in positions of power and the companies that they own, who hold shares in it. I mean, this is, if you like, a kind of an invisible lifeblood of cities, and we need to make it visible and see who is in control of it and in whose interests it's being used. And when we're talking about power, also about how we reclaim power, and one of the things we were talking about, actually before Jeremy Corbyn did, but to give him credit, he did talk about it as well just recently, but things like cooperative alternatives to Uber. Why are we allowing this platform basically to be used by a company that has no interest in its workers and is basically extracting a lot of value out of essentially our information and our needs? They're not really doing very much themselves except connecting people. Well, why can't we do that and think about ownership of things like a cooperative alternative to Uber? The same kind of thought going behind some of the movements to make some of our precious things, like some of the pubs in Brighton are now assets of community value. I'm sure they are in Bristol too, but it's basically the local community coming and reclaiming these assets away from the big owners of them, who probably have never been to Brighton even, or Bristol in this case, but who own a huge amount there. Why aren't we making these assets genuinely of community value, making sure that councils give the option to local communities to buy them first, to make sure that we really bring that ownership back home?
Yeah. Great, thanks very much.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Papa Omotayo, the urbanist. I live and work in Lagos, Nigeria. Has anybody been there to Lagos? Good, good. So the rest of you, I can describe Lagos. Imagine this room with the same number of people 10 times, and we're all trying to share a seat. That's how intense the city is. It's like a city of about 2 million people. Sorry, 22 million people, with 6,000 people coming in every single day to stay from the rural communities. What's really interesting about Lagos is that it actually, having listened to what everyone to say, it's probably like the warning sign of the future of cities if certain things are not paid attention to. And I think the most important thing that we need to understand is sustainable cities need participation from everybody. And Lagos is a prime example of where that has failed, where you currently have massive disconnect between the citizen and the state. And that disconnect raises its head constantly throughout the city in mostly negative ways, but in some really interesting positive ways as well. And most of those positive ways come in terms of how the individuals choose to appropriate space. When you're kind of in conflict where there's no distinctive decision as to who owns what space, the average citizen will decide, this space is mine and I will claim it. And this battle constantly happens throughout the city. I mean, I can tell you outside my office every day, there is a new guy comes, sets up shop, end of the day, somebody from the state comes, clears them away. The next morning, somebody else comes, and this constantly happens because there is no agreement between the state and citizen as to who owns what. Part of it goes back to a Land Act in 1973, but most of it goes back post-colonial, post-independence, when you have a city that was not made for the citizens. You have a successive series of governments who have failed to engage with the citizens in terms of how they should live, the types of city they want it to be. One thing that's been really interesting, which I find problematic, and I see it a little bit in London, is this idea of the generic city. Like aesthetically, you go everywhere and everybody wants to be like New York or Dubai. A recent project in hand is something called the Eko Atlantic in Lagos, which started off as a shoreline protection from the Atlantic as it was eroding part of the city. And all of a sudden, some developers got their hands on it, and it's now sort of turned into this massive new real estate. And loads of public funds have been spent on this, as opposed to regenerating existing communities. Another point in case is what happened, which was the markets, which were sort of a core to Lagos. If you know Lagos, you understand that the street markets, what happens on the street is integral to how the city looks, feels, and tastes like. And how the government have decided in the bid to sort of create this American aesthetic of shopping malls. They've created all these state-backed funded shopping malls that are now empty because obviously economically the people that were on the markets that were selling on the streets can no longer be in them. And all of these things have been done without participation, without engagement with civic organizations, finding out what people want, and what has kind of happened now, and what is sort of you're seeing in the city is government trying to fight back against that and trying to reintegrate projects like there's a beautification project, there's a lot of these green initiatives that are going around. And these things, again, have been done without actually asking the average citizen, okay, what kind of city do you want? Do you actually like to go to a park? I mean, going to a park, I know it's beautiful if you're in London or Paris, but 40 degrees, it's it's not a thing that people tend to do. Meanwhile, the things that the average citizen does, which is put up a tent in the middle of the street and have a party or a wedding, those are the things that have been sidelined. Markets that used to spill onto the street are now being walls have been sort of put up to stop them from spilling out onto the street, and this desire to have a very sort of hospital-like city. So what we've been trying to do in our organization is look at the leftover spaces, the discarded spaces, and see how we can connect what is a growing digital community within Lagos and look at how we can create physical spaces, sort of working within the arts and participation within communities to redesign and revalue these spaces in terms of what actually happens in them, and then connecting those spaces to like the digital community. Because within the digital community, one thing that's really interesting in a city like Lagos is like there's a lot of trust. You know, it's a really, really, really strange thing. People feel a lot more comfortable like sharing very strange things about themselves online as opposed to sort of like being in public space in the city. So for us, it's seeing how maybe that is a way of reconnecting the citizens back into a sense of ownership into the city. And that's really fascinating, because I think to understand how a city that is actually maybe has enough infrastructure for maybe 5 million of the 22 million people, and that is constantly increasing, you have to ask yourself some really, really difficult questions, all right? You have to ask yourself, the models of cities that have traditionally been looked at and are constantly being adopted throughout the world, which are predominantly Western, and you'll have to ask yourself whether those principles actually work anymore. And if they don't work, what should the focus be? And I think one of the really interesting things for us, in which we find, you know, and I think we had a little chat about it, is this idea of allowing communities to decide in the direction of what cities are, allowing cooperatives to sort of work within templates and with the right amount of funding to look at how they can, you know, create specific value propositions for their neighborhoods. And the most difficult thing in that, in a city like Lagos, is the political will. Because obviously the political will is always subject to its own agenda, which is mostly just keeping all the money for themselves. But also the idea of having a very top-down approach to governance, which is, this is the city we want to give you. If you don't like it, the fault is with you. And you have a whole massive generation. Lagos, I think, in 2025, 75% of the population is going to be under 35. So even if you look at it from like a security point of view, you know, where you have a lot of young people who are unemployed, who feel no ownership in the city, that's a cause for extreme alarm. So I think in order for a city like my city to move forward, we really need to engage with creating cities through participation rather than through sort of like conceptual agendas about, you know, we need roads to do this, we need cities to look a certain way. You know, these market women that spill onto the street who don't make the city look nice, they're a problem because it doesn't look like New York and it doesn't look like London. So I think for me, those are the things that I feel, in order to make my city sustainable, that we really need to focus on.
Brilliant.
A lot about more democratization of power, participation, wealth, ownership of space and such. One thing that struck me as well, you know, coming back to your points, Maya, as well, is that there's also a sense of a question around who has cultural ownership of certain concepts and ideas, who owns the conservation and wildlife movement. And I agree with you, Caroline, that your point that it's great that we're taking a step back and looking at these fundamental issues. But I suppose the question might be, are we absolutely confident that these mechanisms really will yield communities that are more sustainable, are more equal, are more inclusive? We're giving more power to communities, but by doing that, we're ceding the power to them as well. So I thought I'd come back to you, George, and then we sort of circle around to some reflections from Maya.
I think there's an element that we've all sort of hovered close to without actually mentioning by name, which does have the potential to stitch together what we're talking about here, and you know, a proven track record of delivering far more in terms of sustainability than current models, which is participatory budgeting. And you know, this is what really make sense of all the ideas that we're talking about. And the classic model is in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil, where 50,000 people every year set the budget. It's just an amazing, as many people as want to become involved, 50,000 is the average involvement. And it has just had the most spectacular results. So it's basically the infrastructure budget that you're talking about, which is 20% of the municipal budget, though I think there are ways of expanding it, the process, into other areas, including national budgeting. But it's really radical and makes this massive impact, because basically it ensures that the infrastructure goes to where it's needed, that it's completely wiped out corruption, it's wiped out clientelism, it's wiped out pork barrel projects, it's wiped out the power of the mafia and other gangs who were previously the only means of social provision that people had. And there's been a massive decline of infant mortality, a massive increase in water quality, quality of sanitation, in nursery places, in the quality of healthcare. Everything has just been transformed by this. Same budget, same amount of money, but because there's no means of escape for those who are controlling the budget now. They can't siphon it off because there are 50,000 pairs of eyes on this, and it's just transformed everything while massively empowering the people of the city.
And those are fantastic. Has it made the city more environmentally sustainable?
Yes, now one of the indicators of this is the quality of the rivers, which has been hugely improved in Porto Alegre. And you can compare it. The great thing about Brazil is that you have lots of cities, some are similar sizes, and some are using participatory budgeting and some are not, so you've got a controlled experiment. And what you see by comparison to those other cities is not only all those social indicators greatly improving, you see a massive improvement of environmental indicators, and basically proper sanitation systems, proper waste sorting and all the rest of it, which has resulted from this, and you'll see that huge improvement in river quality. We could do with a bit of that in this country, by the way. But you also see a great switch towards public transport, less space for the car, more space for buses, trams, and the rest of it.
I'd be interested to know what we can learn about how they did that in an inclusive way. So, for example, when the Greens were a minority administration in Brighton, we experimented with that idea, so giving communities an amount of money, not the whole council budget, but an amount of money to decide themselves how they would like to spend it. But I think, again, there was still a challenge about how you made sure that everybody in that community felt that they had a role to play in that debate, because you can imagine, you hold the meeting in an area of the city that you're used to going to, perhaps in a place like this, which might not be the sort of place where quite a lot of the people in the city would feel comfortable going to. And you have a conversation potentially using language and concepts that not everyone is familiar with. And if you're not very careful, you replicate, in some senses, some of the difficulties that you've got when you're handing that power or leaving that power in the hands of the councillors or whoever is the person holding power in the city. So, I mean, I love the ideas and the proposals from Porto Alegre, and I know the whole kind of participatory budgeting process has spread far and wide, but I'd be interested to really learn about how you make sure that's genuinely inclusive and not just the same people.
There's actually there's an area in Lagos called Massacre, which I think a lot of people have heard about, and it's sort of like on the lagoon, and it's like built on stilts, and it's like a fishing community that's been there for a long time. And it's, the infrastructure is not great. The state has been trying to get rid of it because they've now decided it's prime real estate. But for years, they've been sort of working as a community, participatory budgets, where they will, bring money together, help each other build homes, look after how the community functions and works, and that's all done collectively. But meanwhile, there's an unwillingness to sort of, because I think you made the point, because the people who come to those communities, they're not even willing to engage in the conversation of, how does it work? How do you do this thing? What can we learn from you? It's always more like the direction of talking to them as if, okay, we can do this thing better than you can do it. So I think that discussion, that conversation needs to come the other way around, perhaps.
And Maya, would you like to reflect on that?
I think I agree a lot with Caroline in that And I think it definitely applies to Bristol in that it's a very segregated city. Like all of the different communities are completely separate, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to engage them in the first place. And what's interesting about them is projects in the past that have managed to engage with all the communities. The members are always, very helpful. They're interested. They enjoy being able to make the decisions for themselves instead of having someone like the council or some organisation or whatever it is making the decision for them. So going back to your question, I think that definitely if people care about whatever you're talking to them about, then they definitely will go the distance to help to contribute.
Could I propose a partial answer to Caroline's question? And it's not like there's a one size fits all thing where you can just dump it down and say here it's going to work. But in Porto Alegre, they've been very careful to devolve everything to the smallest possible units. And so instead of one budgeting meeting for the city, there's hundreds, there's literally hundreds in all the little sub-districts of the city. They have their own budgetary committee which looks at the particular needs of that area and then feeds that forward to their representative who takes it to the budget council. But the other thing that they have in Brazil, or have had historically in Brazil, in a big way has been civic education through the sort of pedagogy of the oppressed, this sort of barefoot teaching of civics in a far more engaged and engaging way than we have here, where the educators go into the community and are learning from the community. They're being taught by the people that they're teaching at the same time as they are teaching, and that has created a very strong sense of potential ownership of the political process.
I think the scary thing is that in our curricula, that's kind of gone completely. I mean, there's such a focus now on the kind of, the core subjects and such a narrow straitjacket of a curriculum that the space in there to have those wider debates is getting smaller and smaller, and yet the need for it, as you say, George, is greater than ever. So there's a real disjunction there.
So along those lines of beginning to think broadly, cross systems and structurally, I'd actually like to bring in a bit of a tangential question that emerged on Twitter in advance of this event, and that was someone looked at the program and quite rightfully challenged and said, I don't see in the entire program biodiversity, nature, urban wildlife. Some friends of the Festival of Ideas and the Cabot Institute sort of came back and said, yes, but you have Maya, who's centered on sort of wildlife and conservation. George, your credentials are kind of well known, and Caroline, from the Green Party, and of course, obviously, Papa and many other people are clearly do this. But none of us use that language, and we've not used it much today. And what I wonder is, from your perspectives, is that a mistake? Have we tactically retrenched to deal with these more fundamental issues? Or maybe have we lost the bandwidth in an era of Trump and Brexit and such? I'd like to start with you, Maya, but can we still center wildlife and biodiversity in these conversations?
Yeah, definitely. It's always going to be something that's very central. It's essential to having a city that is sustainable, not just for the actual resources and things like that, but for the people and the mental health of its citizens and all of that side of thing. But I just personally feel that you can't. It's a real struggle to tackle any of those issues, like the green spaces and the urban wildlife and all of those sorts of things, if only a small fraction of the population and like all of the other issues that you guys were talking about aren't tackled first. And I think it just makes it easier for people if you deal with these kind of things.
I think we have, by using words like biodiversity, I mean, for God's sake, what does that mean? For most people, that is not a meaningful term. And I think if we're not careful, the whole language of natural capital and biodiversity and so forth makes this whole debate about the environment seem very other. It's the property of some other scientists and people that know more than we do. And as a result, it's taken it away from something that is actually in our hearts.
Sure.
And what I love about Maya's website when I was looking at it was all about your loves. You love this. I know that you know exactly what subspecies it is or whatever, but you're not putting that in our faces. You're just sharing your love of something. And I just think that's so powerful. And I would love us to get back to talking about love and
great.
nature and beautiful things and how that makes us feel. And it's underpinned with all the evidence that we know that, for example, greener spaces are better for our mental health, and there's huge amounts of medical evidence that will now properly document all of that. But we don't really need that, because we just know from our own experience that when you're surrounded by trees, you feel better. And I think we need to get back to some of that common sense in a way.
Right.
Would you mind if I just said
Absolutely,
something
please
very brief? Because I think it is a good question that's been asked, and and I do find as you know, I'm mad about wildlife and habitats, but I do find myself increasingly talking about structural forces, because unless we tackle the structural forces, we will constantly find ourselves overrun when we're trying to do frontline defence. So a classic example, I was in Sheffield a few days ago and writing about it next week, the Sheffield tree massacre that's taking place at the moment. Why is this happening? Not because the trees need to be cut or anything, it's because the council signed a PFI contract with Amy to restore the streets, which is completely opaque.
Right.
It's all the important bits of it have been redacted. It's commercially confidential. No one knows exactly why they have to cut all the trees down. And you're now facing this Kafkaesque state corporate bureaucracy that is, you just cannot do anything with. You just, this brick wall. And so unless we're dealing with the politics and the economics of this, we're always going to be at a disadvantage when we're trying to engage with the ecological aspects.
And Papa, I actually was going to go back to the artists, but I thought I would draw you into this, because you've done a lot of work with architecture and artists, and I think that actually comes back not only to nature, but to Caroline's points about love and the emotional component of that.
I mean, for me, like, the city is about love. I know it sounds really cheesy, but I think you only, your memories of anything is always emotional. Like, we don't respond to like the technical aspects of cities. We know when we're standing on a vista somewhere. We're not thinking about the scale and the technicalities. We're thinking about the emotional response. So I think, for us in our work, the important is to make the communities that we work with have an emotional response to whatever it is we work together to create. And we hope that emotional response will now translate into sustainable ownership, and the sense of place and the sense of purpose within the city. And then I think we can now move to the different layers and the different components. But I think for me, the emotional response has to be something very much considered in dealing with sustainability.
Great. That's fantastic. And now we're going to open it up all to you. I think what we'll do is we'll take something like a group of 3 questions, and we'll allow the panel to respond to individual or the questions collectively, and we'll see how that goes. So, hands in the air. All right. Fellow in a yellow shirt there.
Can we do woman, man?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to go for... So how about we start with you two here in the front row, and wait before you come running all the way up. This gentleman in the white shirt in the back row. So we'll start with you 3. So I know who you are. So go ahead.
And he knows where you live.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your fantastic intros to the area of sustainable cities. Bristol has had an interesting few years. We had obviously European Green Capital a couple of years ago, with lots of action and some inaction. With Bristol, we've got a community land trust here, which is aimed at trying to access land and aimed at trying to create community-directed housing delivery. We've just delivered 12 homes. We've got another 49 who's just got planning permission in Bristol, and it's about involving self-build and self-finishing the programme. So it's really fantastic sense of awareness of the empowerment of being involved in something and choosing something. So I really like your point, George, right at the beginning about how we access available sites which are left open and sitting there. I wondered whether, before we have a sympathetic government, whether there's a way where we could maybe, we've got a very strong push by the mayor now to try and have greater control at a city level. Could we maybe introduce some sort of taxation or value kind of process to sites to bring them forward for community delivery?
Hi, is this on? Sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up a bit on the point about how we get, in a similar sort of way, I guess, how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be in terms of this democratic engagement? So we heard a little bit about civic education. That's obviously part of the solution, but that's a long-term solution. These kind of participatory democratic processes, I think, require a set of skills in the community and a set of people to help enable, empower, fulfill that potential. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about where that capacity needs to be built, where that can come from, what kind of people and organisations are well placed to do that, so we can start doing that kind of thing and building that capacity now.
Thanks, and feel free to say where you've come from and what your background is.
Sure, I'm actually visiting from London.
Right, yeah, it's all right.
And I have a background in, amongst other things, collaboration between local government and the voluntary sector.
Great, fantastic. And
I wasn't sure if I was yellow shirt person or not. I want to be sort of devil's advocate a little bit.
wait, and you are?
Sorry, hi, I'm Hamish. I'm a water engineer living in Bristol. I want to be a bit of devil's advocate and challenge the participatory approach perhaps. Are there examples where you have a participatory approach, an effective one that engages lots of people and people have access to the right information, but people don't choose an option that gives them, that is long-term sustainability in terms of economic, environmental, and social? I mean, in Bristol, for example, Queen Square is a beautiful square near here, and it's a good example of modern urbanism that used to be a dual carriageway going through the middle of it, and now it's a beautiful Georgian style square. And at the time, there was huge opposition from businesses and residents in the area. They said, well, no business coming through will lose lots of money, won't get parking space anymore. And it took real leadership and actually someone to show them there was a different approach for it to actually happen. So what's the role of leadership, and is there a role for that in participatory approaches where sometimes they might fail?
Well, so just to sort of capture all of that, those questions about how to act, well, I very appropriate question, how to act when central government is maybe not on your side and you have to really find your resources locally. A question around how we get the skills to really engage in all of the ideas that people have been talking about. And well, I'm going to provocatively reframe your question as, what if people do the wrong things when we give them power? And I think this is a good start from a bit of a non-UK perspective on some of these questions.
I mean, in Lagos, people do the wrong things all the time. But I actually think that's important. You know, I was in one of the playable cities things earlier, and they talked about, you know, the importance of rebellion in the city, and I think you have to assume it's never a one-stop approach to everything. So in terms of participatory, it may not work everywhere, right? The important thing is to investigate the places where it may work best. And sometimes, you know, in my city, for instance, you know, like I said before, some of the decisions that people make have actually enhanced the city. You know, when I talk about street hawkers, for instance, right? Lagos is notorious for like street hawkers. So these are like young boys and girls who are selling like, you know, very cheap household goods or cheap food, and it came about because of in the 80s there was something called go slow. If you ever listen to Fala, you'll hear about go slow. It's just like you'd be in traffic for 4 hours going home and it's not moving. So, you know, one of the things that is frustrating about the city is that you're constantly bombarded with these guys that just come off just from nowhere, like hawking you stuff. And, you know, those are people you would argue that are using, it has a negative effect on the city, but it actually serves as a purpose because it forces you to engage with them in a certain way. And most of the time, the stuff that you're selling, it's kind of useful. It's, you know, like it becomes, you can pick up like your shopping in 4-hour traffic. But what I do want to say is that the leadership is absolutely important. And I think, you know, even when we talk about, and I mean, I can't say for Bristol or anything, but I know specifically in Lagos, you know, part of our failure is the lack of leadership, right? And leadership is more about direction than it is about dictation. And I think, when you approach it that way, you can sort of get a lot of benefit from that aspect.
Right. And just jump in for any of the three questions we had.
I love the question about the community land trusts, because I think they do fantastic work, and I would love to see far more blossoming of them. And in terms of not waiting for sympathetic governments, I mean, I would have thought that councils, would have the power to, for example, give you first option when it comes to selling a piece of council land, let's say, because it's going to take you perhaps a little bit longer to get the money together than it would if it was an out of town property developer with a huge land bank and a huge checkbook. But to give you a little bit longer, it's something we've been arguing about in Brighton when cooperatives are coming together, so that you have that time, if you can get the resources together, to have the first option rather than always being at the back of the queue. Right. And I think there might be some ways of doing imaginative things, because it just annoys me so much that in all of the discussion about housing, is it private housing, is it council housing, social housing, but the bit about self-build and mutuals and cooperatives and so forth is never in the mix, and it just seems to be such a wonderful way of unleashing people's creativity and imagination and just their will to get on with stuff, if only they would be allowed to. So I would love to see some more support for that. And then I wanted to be cheeky with the last question, and no one's mentioned Brexit yet, and I thought we've done a whole hour without Brexit, but just when someone said, what you do when people get the answer wrong, I provocatively just found myself thinking But what I want to say about that, without going down the Brexit route, and apologies to anybody I've just offended, is just simply that I think that we need to trust people, but we also need to be able to build into our processes the option of being able to change our minds. That's all I'm going to say. But simply to say, there's a serious point in what I'm saying, in a sense, absolutely. Is that I think that democracy is not a moment. Democracy is a process. Democracy evolves as more information, more feedback mechanisms come into the process, whether that's talking about big controversial decisions at national level or whether it's talking about smaller decisions that you're making in local communities. And I think being open to that is a real challenge, because I think human nature is such that when we think we've taken a decision that is the right one, it's difficult for everyone to then perhaps acknowledge that actually in the light of further information we now need to do something different. But if we could be a little bit more forgiving of ourselves and of each other, and recognise that it is perfectly logical that as we progress down any particular route, more information, more feedback comes, and therefore reassessing is actually a sensible thing to do, rather than a failure or a selling out or whatever else. Then I think the quality of the decision making would be better, and we would certainly be better off with the trust that I feel sure that we should be giving to local communities.
No, you can go first.
So I wanted to try to stitch together the three questions, probably in a rather clumsy way. But we have a government. We've had successive governments which have constantly promised devolution. That cities and districts will be able to set their own policy and set their own budgets and stuff. And of course, all these promises are constantly broken. That all they devolve is responsibility without any of the power and without any of the money.
Yep.
And so basically local authorities get blamed for the cuts made at the central level. And that's all they basically are left with, the blame. And so as a result of that, it's really difficult to do things at the local level. As far as I know, I might be wrong about this, but I don't think cities have the power to create a community right to buy. I don't think they have the power to set a land value tax and stuff. And as a result of this, we end up with a very monotonous and homogenous nation, because there's no diversity between cities. They're all run on the same principles because they're run from the centre. A centre composed of people often who wouldn't be seen dead in half the cities of Britain. They regard them as terrifying places, and they live in a total bubble. And so how could they possibly be fit to govern those cities from a distance, as indeed they do? And it's partly because of that we end up so disempowered and so with such a sort of low view of ourselves as civic actors and as empowered citizens, that we find it really hard then to make sensible and nuanced and long-term decisions. And I'm not saying that if we were all massively empowered citizens we would always make the right decisions, but we have this situation where we are systematically deprived of power over our own lives and power over our surroundings. And then suddenly someone says, oh, we're going to allow you to make a decision. There's no civic education, there's no habit of democracy, and suddenly it's, oh God, do we want a dual carriageway and cut down all the trees, or do we want something? It's people then are like rabbits in the headlights. And I think Brexit was a bit like that, you know. And the thing about Brexit was that for the first time in decades, we've been given the opportunity to make a real choice about something important. And all this time we've been deprived of that. You know, during all the new Labour years, you had an opportunity to vote for big business and bombing or big business and bombing. And so, you know, finally, you're given an opportunity to really exercise power. The only way you can preserve that power is by voting leave. If you vote remain, you just say, oh, we'll carry on with the status quo. So you know, if we're going to expect people to use power cleverly, power has to become a habit. Power has to become something woven into the warp and weft of their lives.
Right. And that's fantastic. I would love to hear your reflections on that, Maya.
I'm not going to assume to talk about anything that I don't know about. The education system has nothing about politics or any of this going on. So a lot of the time I'm just trying to like scrape together information about all sorts of things from like the internet and events like this. But what I am going to say is, basically to your point, is that education is key, because the whole thing with Brexit, from my, well, I can't vote, but from my opinion, was that, like your point, but also the fact that a lot of people were just giving into propaganda without even considering doing research of their own. They're going, oh, we're going to get money for the NHS, let's do that. Oh, I'm going to be a bit controversial, I'm going to do that. And so I think just quickly, I mean, the education system's ridiculously packed full already, but I do think somehow it's essential for people to be able to get political education so that they can make decisions of their own, sensible or not.
Absolutely.
And if I could pick up on one of your initiatives, which is Black to Nature, which is not overtly about skills, but one thing that I've always been impressed by what you've done is you've had some fantastic experiences and done some great things, but you recognize that not everyone has those, and so you've brought in initiatives around inclusivity, as you said in your opening comments. Do you think those initiatives, although not overtly about politics, not overtly about skills development, are beginning to help people engage in these wider conversations?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I know quite a few people that don't vote just because they don't know enough about political parties to vote, which personally seems a bit odd to me. But to them, it's a sensible decision because they don't feel that they can kind of interact with the higher whatever's that's going on in the country because they just don't know what's going on. And I think something that's just very important is to encourage people to express their own views in a way that's been kind of nearly crushed out of them throughout their lifetime, when suddenly taking people and going, okay, it's up to you now, what do you want to do? Like, it doesn't work like that.
Right. We'll open up to another round of questions. I think we might try to go for 4 this time. So I saw, we actually have 4 hands there, so I've got you here in the front row, and you've got a microphone right next to you, and then with your hand up there in the blue shirt, and you in the red shirt there. So, fire away.
Right, so it really doesn't sound like it from here, but so I kind of wanted to ask a little bit about, you talked a lot about leadership and how we don't necessarily have anybody who can sort of like, who can take the lead and say this is what we need to like do something, we need to empower people. And as a young person who's kind of has always been really interested in sustainability, as I'm sure many people of my generation have been and have been brought up to be, I still feel, having done a master's degree at Bristol University, still don't feel like it's something that is very accessible for me to participate in. Right. From a career perspective and also from a sort of like an everyday perspective. And I kind of wanted to get your opinions, because it's quite a broad panel, of what young people can do to engage more proactively and effectively and impactfully on this debate and in the future of our city development.
Thanks. Question back there.
Yeah,
And can you pass the microphone back that way?
25 years ago, I went to university as a mature student, or just before that. We had the Earth Summit in Rio. And right now I'm sitting here feeling like I'm living in a parallel universe where the last 25 years didn't happen. I remember these conversations almost word for word. Obviously Mya-Rose wasn't around then, I don't know about Papa, but I know George and Caroline were. And we're probably having and I try, you know, I'm an environmentalist, therefore I'm inherently an optimist. I don't think we can be an environmentalist if we're not optimistic. But I can remember, you know, we set an Agenda 21, it was all terribly exciting. Local government, I was a local Agenda 21 officer after I graduated. Terrific. Local government employed you for a year to set the world to rights. You know, we did the participatory democracy. The people from the estates did get involved in what they wanted. And I don't know what happened thereafter. You know, it was a really exciting time. And I think it still comes down to what you've all been saying. It is education and money and the power of the money that drives people to fight against each other, keep the refugees out, fight against each other, want this better than that person, not realising that it's not each other they need to be fighting against, it's the power and the money, because we should have the power and the money, and we won't get a sustainable world unless we do.
Right. I think the microphone is there. Thank you, pass.
Yeah, hi. I, like Maya, a lover of nature, but I choose to live in the city despite the fact that you might think that that's not a good place to kind of go and connect with nature. I think the reason I do that is because I think if we're going to really kind of get people connected and saving the planet, then we need to sort out the disconnect that we have with people and nature. And people live in the cities, and therefore we need to change our cities to be a better option for them to connect with that. I'm very fortunate that I work for the Wildlife Trust on a project called My Wild City, and it's all about trying to make Bristol into this nature-rich city where people can do that. And it's all about trying to find ways of making change in very urban situations, but also raising awareness of some of the green spaces that we do have where people can go and connect. One of the big barriers I come across a lot of the time is that communities don't know that they've got green spaces around them, but also it's not supported by any funding, and that we think that nature is for free. And unfortunately, we've removed a lot of the processes that used to make nature free because it used to manage itself. But in an urban environment, that doesn't happen. And so my question really is how do we get that priority level raised for the environment? Because it's often the thing that we'll sacrifice the first in budgets, or we'll sacrifice because the council needs to sell land to raise money for other things. And if cities are going to get more and more dense as more people move into them, then the competition for that land is going to get really high. So I'm an optimist still. And I love my job, but yeah, some finances would help.
Right. And one last question.
Yes, hello. I agree with George, actually, that fundamentally the problem is about where power lies and the structure that we have in this country. Britain, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it is one of the most centralised governmentally, one of the most centralised countries in the world, which makes it more difficult perhaps than in other places to have power at local level. Nevertheless, within those confines, our local councils do have some power, which they are given by central government. But I have discovered that even at local level, the power that elected representatives have is very limited by the bureaucracies which they work in. And it often seems to me far too often that even though councillors, elected representatives, want to do what I regard as, say, the right thing, they're continually hamstrung by opposition within the bureaucracies and the offices in the social services, civil services, both at national and local level, that have so much real power. How do we actually combat that is my question.
Right. But so to pull all that together, I mean, we had quite a challenging question, which is, we've been talking about a lot of this stuff for 25 years, and how are we really going to unlock that? But then maybe three other questions that might begin to hint at that. We had a question about how do we actually make these processes and politics genuinely accessible to the young. There was a question about how we sort out the disconnect that we have with nature and therefore raise environment higher up the priority list. And then ultimately this, I think, really important question, because it's easy to blame central government, but how power is limited not only by national government, but by our own civil services and our own institutions. So that's quite a handful. Anyone want to jump into that? Yeah?
So I'll start with the question over there, as I think it's the one in which all the other stuff hinges. These, 25 years now, have all taken place during the neoliberal era. And this is the era in which we're encouraged to see human society as a market, where our transactions between each other should be commercial transactions, where we are meant to have a society of winners and losers and discern who the winners are because they're rich and who the losers are because they're poor, and attach merit to those things. And government is supposed to be out of the way. Trades unions are supposed to be out of the way. Civic life in general is supposed to be out of the way. There is no such thing as society. And this is the worst possible circumstance for trying to address the environmental crisis. In fact, the reason why the environmental crisis has accelerated to the extent that it has is that the world has been governed by this crazy ideology throughout that whole period, and still is. Those of you who might be coming to my talk this evening, here's some answers as to how we're going to tackle this, and finally bring this zombie ideology to an end. What do you do with zombies? Well, however you get rid of zombies, we're going to get rid of the zombie that way. And one of the paradoxes of this, to come to the last question, because I think it ties in very well. One of the things that neoliberalism promised us was an end to bureaucracy. One of the original thinkers, Ludwig von Mises, wrote a book called Bureaucracy, and it was about how the sort of social democratic state creates this crushing bureaucracy, and we, the neoliberals, are going to free you from it. Exactly the opposite has happened. That we end up with this state corporate bureaucracy and this crushing regime of monitoring and quantification and quotas and all these sort of crazy forms of everybody having to sort of to fulfill certain criteria. As an academic, you'll be very aware of this.
Very aware.
In the public sector, in the private sector, if you're unemployed, and it's spirit crushing, it destroys everything. And what it's done is massively to empower the bureaucracy, while our elected representatives have been disempowered, because you're not meant to make decisions by political means anymore. It's just meant to be by market means. And so there's been this sort of pseudo-marketization of the civil service, which has given it this tremendous power of auditing and control over elected representatives. And it's one of the many paradoxical and disastrous impacts of this utterly bonkers system under which we live. Which is now going to change.
Caroline, I'd love to hear your comments on any of that, but also in particular, as someone who's been in government for a while, if you could
Not
also...
in government, my friend, Parliament.
Parliament, sorry, yeah, absolutely.
I wish.
As someone who's been in the game for a while,
that sounds even worse.
It would be great if you could also touch on the question about, come on, how are we going to get the young people really, into the mix?
Yeah.
But feel free to reflect on everything.
Okay. Well, let me just come in where George left off, because he's too modest to plug his book. But his latest book is fantastic, because I think what it does, in a sense, is to just remind us that the times we are living through, these neoliberal times, are not normal. They're not, we just take it for granted that that's the way things are, because they've been that way for so long. And I think the importance of stepping back and recognizing, as George has said, that this is a set of choices we have made, and Mrs. Thatcher's famous, Tina, there is no alternative, it's just a load of bollocks. It just is. There are plenty of alternatives, but we've kind of forgotten it because we've been living in this particular type of market-driven world for so long. And it is funny how we just kind of think that's the way stuff is. And it's so important to step out and remember that there are different ways of doing it. And I guess my take on that bit of the question as well is that even though we are living in these very, very difficult times for being able to give value to things that the marketplace doesn't give values to, I think what's quite interesting is that the fossil fuel companies have had a bit of a fight on their hands. I mean, they have had to kind of, fight back. And I don't think we should be under any illusion that what we're facing here is a real battle of ideas, of paradigms, if you like. And what scares me, I guess, is the way in which, for example, now those fossil fuel companies are not just lobbying politicians, they are getting places themselves inside Whitehall to draw up the legislation themselves, cut out the middle person. Why bother lobbying an MP when you can just go and write the legislation yourself? I put some questions to what was then the Department for Environment and Climate Change to find out how many secondees from the fossil fuel companies were inside DEC doing that stuff. And there are loads of them. And they're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts because they genuinely have the interests of you and I at heart. They are doing it because it shores up their vested interests. So I think we should be under no illusion that actually there is a massive battle of ideas going on right now. It might not be that visible, but believe me, it's happening. And that revolving door between government and these big companies is spinning as fast as it ever has. And so we've got a battle on our hands, my friends, and that is one of the reasons I think that we haven't made the progress that I would have expected us to as well. I mean, I joined the Green Party 31 years ago, confident that by the early 80s, we would have MPs and things would be changing, and clearly life hasn't worked out quite like that. I want to just say a word about the electoral system as well, and I'm not saying that's the silver bullet, but it would help if people didn't feel so disenfranchised at election time. And I know that democracy is far more than just voting once every 5 years, 4 years, whatever. But that last election we had a few months ago, 68% of votes cast made absolutely bugger all difference to the result. 68% of us may as well just have stayed in bed, because essentially they were stacking up under first past the post and don't actually impact the result at all. And it seems to me that one of the themes we've been talking about is about democracy and power and so forth. And when so many of us are so fundamentally disenfranchised, even in that key moment when we think we're putting the cross in the box, then that's problematic. And to the question about young people, which is vital to all of this, then to continue the theme of electoral systems, then giving votes to people at 16. I don't know what Maya thinks about that, and I take your point that I take the point we need the education, because a lot of, I know I've spoken in schools where surprisingly at first to me young people were saying, well, no, I don't think we're ready to have the information to cast the vote. But to be honest, that's not a particularity of young people. There's plenty of people that don't necessarily seek out the information before they cast the vote. But that's another reason for making space in our curriculum for whatever we want to call it, political education, civics, whatever, but basically about how do you have influence over the world around you, which seems to me to be one of the biggest questions we could be trying to answer.
Great. And this feels like a very good time to, for Papa, you to come in again with a bit of a non-UK perspective on some of these conversations.
Yeah, I think, the market forces, global capitalism is the same everywhere. I mean, traditionally, where I come from, I'm Yoruba. I come from outside Lagos, a place called Ijebu-Ode. And how did you get land? You pick up a stone, you throw it as far as you can, and that's yours. That's how it worked for generations and generations and generations. So it is about the choices. And what we choose to, land is so much about power, and Lagos is no different to the rest of the world. It's allowing for massive amounts of disfranchisement. Also, it's allowing for massive divides in class. But it really doesn't have to be that way, because traditionally it wasn't that way. It's just the adoption of the same sort of politics and the same sort of neoliberalism that fundamentally is the cause of, I can see, a lot of problems. But I think it's really, when you talk about 25 years, wow, it seems like a long time, but at the same time, when we're talking about something that we all benefit from, which is money, right? Everybody here are happy if their house prices go up, all right? And that's the same all over the world, because that's what we've been told is valuable. How much money we have in our pocket, how much our lives are sort of valued by this system that has been kind of artificially created. So 25 years seems a long way, but it's a battle in essence, So I think the importance of education is so fundamental for the next generation. It's like, you know, how you engage them in making decisions that reorientate what they value. And for me, you know, my focus is about valuing public space and working with people, engaging with them in what good and bad public space is. And hopefully that can allow for a better, more sustainable city.
And Maya, reflections, again, on any of those questions?
I am young, so I might have some reflections of being a young person. And I think personally, something for me which makes me feel like I'm contributing a lot, I feel engaged with lots of other people, is just going online and like interacting with all the different people and joining campaigns and things like that. It makes me feel like I'm having an impact on things, but also more physical ideas, maybe a bit specific, but I persistently send my MP, Jacob Rees-Mogg, letters, and I have no expectation of him reading them, but it gives me a small amount of joy to just kind of bother him. And
civil services, both at national and local level, have so much real power. How do we actually combat that is my question.
Right. But so to pull all that together, I mean, we had quite a challenging question, which is, we've been talking about a lot of this stuff for 25 years, and how are we really going to unlock that? But then maybe three other questions that might begin to hint at that. We had a question about how do we actually make these processes and politics genuinely accessible to the young. There was a question about how we sort out the disconnect that we have with nature and therefore raise environment higher up the priority list. And then ultimately this, I think, really important question, because it's easy to blame central government, but how power is limited not only by national government, but by our own civil services and our own institutions. So that's quite a handful. Anyone want to jump into that? Yeah?
So I'll start with the question over there, as I think it's the one in which all the other stuff hinges. These, 25 years now, have all taken place during the neoliberal era. And this is the era in which we're encouraged to see human society as a market, where our transactions between each other should be commercial transactions, where we are meant to have a society of winners and losers and discern who the winners are because they're rich and who the losers are because they're poor, and attach merit to those things. And government is supposed to be out of the way. Trades unions are supposed to be out of the way. Civic life in general is supposed to be out of the way. There is no such thing as society. And this is the worst possible circumstance for trying to address the environmental crisis. In fact, the reason why the environmental crisis has accelerated to the extent that it has is that the world has been governed by this crazy ideology throughout that whole period, and still is. Those of you who might be coming to my talk this evening, here are some answers as to how we're going to tackle this, and finally bring this zombie ideology to an end. What do you do with zombies? Well, however you get rid of zombies, we're going to get rid of the zombie that way. And one of the paradoxes of this, to come to the last question, because I think it ties in very well. One of the things that neoliberalism promised us was an end to bureaucracy. One of the original thinkers, Ludwig von Mises, wrote a book called Bureaucracy, and it was about how the sort of social democratic state creates this crushing bureaucracy, and we, the neoliberals, are going to free you from it. Exactly the opposite has happened. That we end up with this state corporate bureaucracy and this crushing regime of monitoring and quantification and quotas and all these sort of crazy forms of everybody having to sort of to fulfill certain criteria. As an academic, you'll be very aware of this.
Very aware.
In the public sector, in the private sector, if you're unemployed, and it's spirit crushing, it destroys everything. And what it's done is massively to empower the bureaucracy, while our elected representatives have been disempowered, because you're not meant to make decisions by political means anymore. It's just meant to be by market means. And so there's been this sort of pseudo-marketization of the civil service, which has given it this tremendous power of auditing and control over elected representatives. And it's one of the many paradoxical and disastrous impacts of this utterly bonkers system under which we live, which is now going to change.
Caroline, I'd love to hear your comments on any of that, but also in particular, as someone who's been in government for a while, if you could
Not
also...
in government, my friend, Parliament.
Parliament, sorry, yeah, absolutely.
I wish.
As someone who's been in the game for a while,
That sounds even worse.
it would be great if you could also touch on the question about, come on, how are we going to get the young people really, into the mix?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
feel free to reflect on everything.
Okay. Well, let me just come in where George left off, because he's too modest to plug his book. But his latest book is fantastic, because I think what it does, in a sense, is to just remind us that the times we are living through, these neoliberal times, are not normal. They're not, we just take it for granted that that's the way things are, because they've been that way for so long. And I think the importance of stepping back and recognising, as George has said, that this is a set of choices we have made, and Mrs. Thatcher's famous, Tina, there is no alternative, it's just a load of bollocks. It just is. There are plenty of alternatives, but we've kind of forgotten it because we've been living in this particular type of market-driven world for so long. And it is funny how we just kind of think that's the way stuff is. And it's so important to step out and remember that there are different ways of doing it. And I guess my take on that bit of the question as well is that even though we are living in these very, very difficult times for being able to give value to things that the marketplace doesn't give values to, I think what's quite interesting is that the fossil fuel companies have had a bit of a fight on their hands. I mean, they have had to kind of, fight back. And I don't think we should be under any illusion that what we're facing here is a real battle of ideas, of paradigms, if you like. And what scares me, I guess, is the way in which, for example, now those fossil fuel companies are not just lobbying politicians, they are getting places themselves inside Whitehall to draw up the legislation themselves, cut out the middle person. Why bother lobbying an MP when you can just go and write the legislation yourself? I put some questions to what was then the Department for Environment and Climate Change to find out how many secondees from the fossil fuel companies were inside DEC doing that stuff, and there are loads of them, and they're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts because they genuinely have the interests of you and I at heart. They are doing it because it shores up their vested interests. So I think we should be under no illusion that actually there is a massive battle of ideas going on right now. It might not be that visible, but believe me, it's happening, and that revolving door between government and these big companies is spinning as fast as it ever has. And so we've got a battle on our hands, my friends, and that is one of the reasons I think that we haven't made the progress that I would have expected us to as well. I mean, I joined the Green Party 31 years ago, confident that by the early 80s, we would have MPs and things would be changing, and clearly life hasn't worked out quite like that. I want to just say a word about the electoral system as well, and I'm not saying that's the silver bullet, but it would help if people didn't feel so disenfranchised at election time. And I know that democracy is far more than just voting once every 5 years, 4 years, whatever. But that last election we had a few months ago, 68% of votes cast made absolutely bugger all difference to the result. 68% of us may as well just have stayed in bed, because essentially they were stacking up under first past the post and don't actually impact the result at all. And it seems to me that one of the themes we've been talking about is about democracy and power and so forth. And when so many of us are so fundamentally disenfranchised, even in that key moment when we think we're putting the cross in the box, then that's problematic. And to the question about young people, which is vital to all of this, then to continue the theme of electoral systems, then giving votes to people at 16. I don't know what Maya thinks about that, and I take your point that I take the point we need the education, because a lot of, I know I've spoken in schools where surprisingly at first to me young people were saying, well, no, I don't think we're ready to have the information to cast the vote. But to be honest, that's not a particularity of young people. There's plenty of people that don't necessarily seek out the information before they cast the vote. But that's another reason for making space in our curriculum for whatever we want to call it, political education, civics, whatever, but basically about how do you have influence over the world around you, which seems to me to be one of the biggest questions we could be trying to answer.
Great. And this feels like a very good time to, for Papa, you to come in again with a bit of a non-UK perspective on some of these conversations.
I think, the market forces, global capitalism is the same everywhere. I mean, traditionally, where I come from, I'm Yoruba. I come from outside Lagos, a place called Ijebu-Ode. And how did you get land? You pick up a stone, you throw it as far as you can, and that's yours. That's how it worked for generations and generations and generations. So it is about the choices, and what we choose to, land is so much about power. And Lagos is no different to the rest of the world. It's allowing for massive amounts of disfranchisement. Yeah. Also, it's allowing for massive divides in class. But it really doesn't have to be that way, because traditionally it wasn't that way. It's just the adoption of the same sort of politics and the same sort of neoliberalism that fundamentally is the cause of, I can see, quite a lot of problems. Yeah. But I think it's really, when you talk about 25 years, wow, it seems like a long time, but at the same time, when we're talking about something that we all benefit from, which is money, right? Everybody here are happy if their house prices go up, all right? And that's the same all over the world, because that's what we've been told is valuable. How much money we have in our pocket, how much our lives are sort of valued by this system that has been kind of artificially created. So 25 years seems a long way, but it's a battle in essence, So I think the importance of education is so fundamental for the next generation. It's how you engage them in making decisions that reorientate what they value. And for me, my focus is about valuing public space and working with people, engaging with them in what good and bad public space is. And hopefully that can allow for a better, more sustainable city.
And Maya, reflections, again, on any of those questions?
I am young, so I might have some reflections of being a young person. And I think personally, something for me which makes me feel like I'm contributing a lot, I feel engaged with lots of other people, is just going online and interacting with all the different people and joining campaigns and things like that. It makes me feel like I'm having an impact on things, but also more physical ideas, maybe a bit specific, but I persistently send my MP, Jacob Rees-Mogg, letters, and I have no expectation of him reading them, but it gives me a small amount of joy to just kind of bother him. And
Does he reply?
Well, his secretary types up a very polite email saying no every time to whatever I'm complaining about. But I just think that even if you're not necessarily making the massive political jumps and influencing the whole of society and making Bristol better in 5 years' time and all that kind of stuff, all of the much smaller things you can do can, as well as making a difference slowly, step by step, it can also kind of encourage you to keep on going, because when you are going for 25 years, even the tiniest of steps forward, it's a massive thing, because nothing seems to be moving. I mean, I've been engaged in these kind of communities for about 3 years now, and I'm already sick to death of going up to London to go to whatever new thing's going on that's going to change the whole game. So I think just anything that you manage to achieve, whether it's in legislation or just kind of within your peer group or whatever it is, does mean a lot.
I feel like, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative and actually throw my own answer into the mix and reflect upon this comment that this economic state is relatively recent. And the example I use from back home in the States is that some of the most progressive environmental legislation ever passed in the United States was passed by Richard Nixon. and it gives you a sense of how far the goalposts have shifted in terms of policies and politics. And I think it's fair to say that neoliberalism in many ways was a direct response to us becoming aware of environmental degradation and a growing of the environmental movement across multiple parties. So we need to recognize that it's not been around that long and we can change it. We're allowed to go, because we started late, I've got permission for us to go 5 minutes over. So I think we can squeeze in 2 more quick questions. Oh, we've got a lot of hands coming. All right, so you with the beard and the white shirt. And then we want to have a bit of diversity and balance. So well, all right. We've tried to okay. All right, so you can go on. Right.
Hello.
So you first.
Hi, it's Sean Williams. I'm Friends of the Earth's regional campaign at South West England. And I just really wanted to embrace George's analysis really of kind of where we've got to. And I think one of the struggles that we're engaged in here in Bristol is trying to improve the city's air pollution. And I just wondered whether the panel had thoughts really in the way that central government has kind of shunted responsibility for fixing this problem to local authorities. Our analysis suggests that they probably haven't provided a number of the tools that would be useful to fixing it. One of the things I'm hearing a lot from leaders in the city is that they have very legitimate concerns, I feel, about how that pans out in terms of environmental justice. And so if anything's going to bite the dust, it's going to be that first. And so I think it really speaks to the point about how we engage with communities, how we'd really like to see this to be a community-led struggle. But given that Bristol needs to come up with a plan by March, a draft plan for the Secretary of State by March, and that work can be quite deep work, does the panel have any thoughts about something that we can do in that kind of time scale to try and enable those voices to be heard?
Right, your question.
Hi, it's John Casey. I'm the Sustainable Design Manager for Atkins. Just like to introduce the point about just the speed of industrialisation and just all of these processes. I work in an infrastructure industry and just things get built so quickly and there's never really a moment of time to reflect. And I think in the past there has been more time to reflect and just the decision making was slower. And that decision making is so fast now that those wrong decisions can come thick and fast really, really quickly. So the question is, how is industrialisation going to be controlled and directed to deliver the sustainability into these cities?
So since we're near the end of time, I'll ask all of you to reflect on, maybe not just those questions, but as sort of just some final wrapping up thoughts as well. But we have some questions around basically local government not having the power and capacity to address problems that they're charged with and want to, specifically around air pollution, and a very large question around industrialization and the pace of it and how it's going to go in the future and such. But again, I'll start with George because you seem to like being put on the spot, and but maybe also wrap up some wider reflections as well.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, the air pollution crisis is a classic tragedy of open access. Quite wrongly, Garrett Hardin in 1968 produced this paper called The Tragedy of the Commons, where he blamed commons regimes for everyone just loading as much of their own stuff. He said, you've got this common pasture, and everyone in the common is going to want to put as many animals on that pasture as possible, and they get the benefit and the community loses. He'd never actually come across a commons regime. He didn't even understand what a commons regime was. A commons regime is something owned by the community where the community is in charge and sets the rules. What he was describing was an open access regime. And the streets are a classic open access regime. Even though they're owned technically by the state or sometimes now by the private sector, you can load as big a car as you can possibly get onto the streets and everybody else suffers for it. And what we're faced with now is this sort of convergence of an ecological and an economic crisis, because people are getting bigger and bigger cars through contract purchasing, with a subprime mortgage type crisis brewing as a result, because you cannot afford the cars which are on the road at the moment. People won't be able to afford to maintain their payments with the personal debt crisis which is developing. It could bring the whole thing crashing down once more, and this time it'll be cars, not houses, which does it. And so, we have government saying, we've got to have more cars being sold because that's good for the economy. It's likely to crash the economy. And it's good for people to have this extra mobility. Well, actually, it's going to completely knacker our mobility because of all the diseases of pollution that we acquire over time. And it's a classic instance of the short-term interests of some overriding the long-term interests of everyone. And so it's a classic instance of the need for government to say, we've got to think about this strategically. And what are we faced with? What do we see? Well, we see a few city centres perhaps becoming air quality zones where you have congestion charging and stuff. In my experience, it's now the feeder roads which are the really polluted places, and they're the places where people live. And the city centres, which are often quite elite places, because, as Caroline was saying, a lot of people in the suburbs can't even afford to go to the city centre. They have no call to go to the city centre. Might become sort of reasonably less polluted bubbles. They'll still be too polluted. Sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's a lot to unpack there,
sorry,
I realize.
I'll just stop there.
Right. Caroline.
Well, I want to take us full circle because we started off the session talking about power, and I want us to end by talking about power because I want to make the case that we've all got more power than we think we have, and so I want to also be a bit party political at the risk of being thrown out. But we were talking about the Sheffield trees, and some of the councillors who have really put their bodies literally on the front line and just been arrested have been Green councillors trying to stop those trees being cut down. She's in massive trouble, Alison Teal, with the local council. They're trying to get her, sent to the the standards boards for local authorities and so on. But she just took her power and stood in front of that tree, in front of someone who was trying to chop it down. I think that when it comes to local cities trying to stop air pollution, they should just take whatever powers they need to do it. Let's just be a little bit more, let's just be a bit more mischievous and, just take our power. And in Paris, they just simply stop cars coming in on certain days when the pollution is too high. Well, let's just try it. It drives me mad that when it comes to resources, in the US, they seem to have very effectively lobbied fines on VW for all of the deliberate cheating when it came to those cheat devices on the diesel cars. We haven't done any of that yet. Well, come on, let's get the money from VW, who were deliberately poisoning us, shortening our lives. This is what air pollution is about. Let us get some fines on them, which we can then put into the places that we need it. And here in Bristol, I know again, the Greens on the local council got a motion through unanimously last year for clean air zones in Bristol. Fantastic. Let's just take the power and make them happen.
Great. And Papa, final reflections.
Yeah, you pretty much said it. No, I totally agree with the whole idea of taking power. And, in Lagos, for instance, it's something that happens all the time, out of necessity, as opposed to anything else. So I think that would really be my reflection: is just take
to the barricades.
Take I mean, you want to feel ownership of the city. Just go out and
throw a stone.
Take your spot. Yeah.
Not in a bag.
Exactly.
That's going to get in the Daily Mail.
MP
calls for throwing stones.
And Maya, final reflections.
George and Caroline are always very thorough in summing things up. But I guess, basically just everyone can do their own little thing to try and help whatever they think's important. And power to the people.
That's great. All right. Well, that's a good point to end on. Just finish that round of applause for yourself.